In November of 1942, the British Army scored major victories in North Africa over German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox by his Allied adversaries, commanded some of Germany's most effective and feared fighting troops. The defeat of Rommel and the Afrika Korps was a significant victory for the Allies in World War II, but posed a serious problem for the British. How would the British manage 100,000 captured German and Italian prisoners of war? The population of POWs in camps on the British island was swelling to unmanageable numbers. It would be impossible to house, feed, and control 100,000 additional German and Italian prisoners in British prison camps that were already filled to capacity. So the British government turned to Washington for help. Great Britain urged the Roosevelt administration to establish prisoner of war camps in America and reduce the number of the POWs on their way to England. At first, the United States refused to take prisoners of war from the British for several reasons. The U.S. government did not have the experience required to coordinate the transportation, housing, and administration of a large number of prisoners of war. Also, most of the trained soldiers in the United States military were fighting overseas, and America had limited personnel who could guard prisoners. But after intense negotiations, the persistent British convinced the U.S. government to transfer a large number of POWs from England and establish prisoner of war camps within the borders of the United States. So by 1943, German and Italian soldiers captured in North Africa were on their way to America. President Roosevelt wanted a secure and remote environment to house the large number of prisoners of war to eliminate the opportunities for escape and minimize the fear among Americans. Several sites around the nation, including Arkansas, were chosen for POW campsites. 3 primary military sites were chosen in Arkansas to house the contingent of German and Italian prisoners of war. The sites included Camp Chaffee in western Arkansas, Camp Robinson near Little Rock, and Camp Dermott in southern Arkansas. Prior to the arrival of German and Italian prisoners of war, Camp Dermott had been the site of a Japanese-American relocation center. Japanese Americans, primarily from the West Coast, were relocated to Dermott at the beginning of the war. Harry Keats was a guard and administrator in various POW camps around the state during World War II.
And those people there were internees from the West Coast that the United States government wasn't real sure of, and so they brought them in, and they weren't really fenced-in prisoners or guarded prisoners, although we had a lot of American personnel there to take care of them and to watch after them. And they had their children were in the United States Army, a lot of them. You know, it's just like picking anybody up from their home and taking them in, putting them in a camp like that. It wouldn't be very pleasurable. And I'm sure that a lot of them felt real bad towards the United States for that.
Life in the POW camps in Arkansas was pleasant under the circumstances. All prisoner of war camps in the United States were governed by the rules established by the Geneva Convention of 1929. These rules stated that all prisoners must be housed, well-fed, and given proper medical care. Red Cross officials who visited the camps around the nation stated that Camp Robinson set an example as a model prison facility.
Most of the prisoners that came to Camp Robinson came from Rommel's Afrika Korps, and they'd been fighting in North Africa for a long period of time. When they came to Camp Robinson, they were housed in semi-permanent structures. They were wood frame buildings with a siding called insulite, and they had tar paper roofs. They were housed in a compound that would house about 1,000 to 1,500 prisoners. There were 3 compounds side by side, each separated by a fence, and then around the entire camp was a double fence with guard towers, and in the guard towers were machine guns and searchlights. Within each compound, in addition to the barracks, you had dining facilities, latrine facilities, and a canteen for the prisoners. They participated in a wide variety of sports. There were small sports fields inside each compound where they played horseshoes. They played a game called ring tennis, which we're not too sure what it was about. They tossed rings back and forth across a net. And then there was a large field outside where they played soccer. As a matter of fact, they went through soccer balls so fast there was a shortage of soccer balls in Arkansas during the war. And they also, at Camp Robinson, spent a lot of time building rock gardens. They had some elaborate rock gardens where they constructed model castles and model towns out of rocks and stuff they picked up on the coast. They did have church services. They had both primarily Lutheran and Catholic were the two primary religions. And they had some of their own chaplains had been captured. They also gave services, and then also they brought in chaplains to give those services.
Prisoners of war participated in a variety of job duties around the camp that included everything from working in the kitchen to maintaining camp grounds. But as the wartime economy in Arkansas was jeopardized by a dwindling labor force, the job description for POWs held in the state was about to change. In 1943, Arkansas was a poor and rural state. Like most Americans, Arkansans were contributing to the war effort in a variety of ways. Young men volunteered or were drafted into military service. Others left the state for high-paying factory jobs in war-related industries. The sudden depletion of able-bodied young men to the war effort left a large labor vacuum in the agriculture and timber industry. The concern of farmers in Arkansas during World War II was finding labor to plant and harvest the crops so the economy of Arkansas could survive. The solution to this problem would come from a very unusual source. Using POW labor for non-war-related industry was permitted under the rules of the Geneva Convention and sanctioned by the United States government under certain conditions. Employers using POW labor had to prove that there was a shortage of labor that existed in the community. The prisoners had to be paid for their efforts, and the same labor laws that applied to American workers also applied to prisoners of war. Local farm associations were eager to take advantage of this new labor pool to plant and harvest crops. After all, there were over 10,000 prisoners of war located in military camps throughout the state. The biggest problem about using POWs for labor was how to get the prisoners to the sites where work needed to be done. To make the transfer of POW labor easy from camps Chaffee, Dermott, and Robinson, over 30 prisoner of war branch camps were developed throughout Arkansas, mostly along the eastern border of the state. Fortunately for some communities, prisoner housing was available in the form of Civilian Conservation Corps barracks, built during the days of the Depression. POWs in Victoria, near Osceola, were to be housed in an old hotel-type building. That meant that German and Italian troops captured during the North African campaign would be away from the security of military installations like Camp Chaffee and Camp Robinson, and living in small communities throughout rural Arkansas. The idea of having prisoners of war living and working in their communities struck fear in the hearts of some townspeople.
Yes, we were scared, and my mother, I never will forget what my mother said. She said, "Oh my goodness, prisoners of war coming out here on the farm," she said to my dad. He said, "Yeah," but she said, "Well, won't that be dangerous, Kurt?" That's his name. And my dad said, "No, because they will be sending soldiers with them to guard, you know." I actually hated them because of the war, I actually hated them. I thought, hey, man, they got no business bringing them out to Jonesboro. I had 2 or 3 other buds, and they said, "I just can't believe Dad's going to bring them prisoners out here on this farm," Now, that's the attitude that most people had about them.
That Victoria one day, I was walking along, and some man came along in his pickup and stopped, and he said, "Hey, fella, you with that camp down there?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Well, I'd just like to go down there and shoot a few of those Germans." And I said, "I'd do my best to shoot you before you shot one if I could, mister." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, if you really want to shoot some, there's plenty of them running around over in the war zone that be happy to see you over there." And he just drove off and didn't say any more.
But the townspeople had little to fear from the prisoners of war. The POWs were put to work in a variety of jobs around the state, mostly in the agriculture and timber industry under the watchful eye of U.S. military guards.
They would come down each day and chop cotton for us. And this field to my left here, there was 80 acres of hay. They helped us put that hay up. They would come out each morning, and they sent the soldiers to guard them. They had soldiers out there with guns, and so they wouldn't run off. And but they were very good workers, and we used them on numerous occasions. And it was a boom for our farm here, because labor had begun to move off at that time, going to the city, and it really helped us.
For their work, the POWs were paid 80 cents a day. Part of the money was set aside for the POWs for life after the war. Another part of the money was used to purchase items like toiletries, candy, even beer in the Camp PX. Some of the items purchased by the prisoners of war were articles that were hard to come by in the civilian population due to wartime rationing.
Well, for a long time after the civilian population of the area could not buy brand name cigarettes, chewing gum, and the best brands of candy, the Germans were still, and we were, military, able to get those items. And that went on for several months, and the folks in the area knew about it and got to complaining about it, and so that was eliminated too. We had to go to the old off-brand cigarettes and chewing gum, candy, and so forth that everyone else was buying in the stores around.
Despite the fact that the branch camp prisoners were away from the security of the military installations like Camp Robinson, there were few escape attempts at any POW camp in the United States. But prisoners did stray away from a work detail. In July of 1944, 2 prisoners who had been working in woodlands west of Jonesboro went in search of a cool drink of water, much to the surprise of the occupants of the home. In most cases, discipline was not a problem at the branch camps, but occasionally a prisoner refused to participate in work details. At the Wynn camp, one prisoner refused to pick cotton. To encourage him to work, the American Guards administered a punishment unique to Arkansas.
So instead of taking him back to the camp that night when work was done, they stationed him with a guard, and they made him stand in the field all night, and they shined the Jeep lights on him. They let the mosquitoes that are common in northeast Arkansas chew on him all night long, and the next morning they told him, now you're going to work in these fields or we're going to stay out here again tonight. And he did a full day's work that day. So,
despite the relative order and discipline among prisoners, serious problems with POWs did occur in the camps. Fanatical Nazis would terrorize other prisoners who disagreed with Nazi Party philosophy.
We had a couple that we were pretty sure that were in the SS troops in Germany. And, they were a pretty rough bunch of folks. And I don't know, and I didn't know exactly what happened, but at Victoria there was a little fella there, and he declared himself to be, I believe he was an Austrian too, if I remember correctly. And he didn't believe in some of the things that the SS troops had done, and he made it known, and so they got a hold of him and probably were going to wipe him out, but we got word of it real quick and went into the camp and rescued him. And then we transferred him away from Victoria.
For the most part, life in the POW camps was orderly and uneventful. In most branch camps, the prisoners were friendly with the farmers they worked for and the military personnel. And before the war's end, friendships grew between the POWs and their captors. Willie was a German POW who worked as a chef in an eastern Arkansas branch camp. This Thanksgiving menu was signed by Willie and several other POWs and given to Harry Keats as a token of their friendship.
Oh yeah, Willie was quite a character. Like I said, he weighed about, I expect Willie weighed 250, 60 and was about 6'4". But he was one of the nicest men that you'd ever meet. And one day I took him fishing, and I had taken him fishing on numerous occasions, just down on the 31 ditch, which is all half a mile from the camp there at Victoria. And one day he caught a fish, and I had on a long fatigue jacket, and he didn't know that I had a gun. And so when I went down through the brush and all to where he was, the brush caught my fatigue jacket and exposed my .45. And he became real upset about that. And so I just took the gun off and said, "Here, Willie, you carry it a while." I said, "I just brought this out in case we ran across some snakes or something. It's not to guard you." I said, "I've been with you a lot of times, no gun, and didn't worry about you at all." And I said, "Because of the long association, we know what type of people you are." And I said, "This gun is not to guard you."
Ironically, some prisoners of war actually had relatives living in the United States. Corporal Heinz Bartel was a German soldier captured in Sicily and sent to Camp Robinson in 1944. Bartel frequently wrote letters to his uncle in New York about the war and life as a prisoner in Arkansas.
June 30th, 1944. Since May 15th, I am now on duty in the POW hospital in Camp Robinson. The work is pretty good and the hours are running much faster than before. My job is to keep the charts and daily reports running or to go with patients to the different medical departments. In July, I'm supposed to night guard in the wards, so everything is running its own way. How are you over there in Brooklyn? This time it is pretty hot here in Arkansas. I suppose it will be a little cooler. The most hours in my off-duty time are filled with sport and surveying exercises. Now it is time to finish my letter for today. Thank you all so much for your last letter. Your nephew, Hans.
Occasionally, prisoners of war would come face to face with relatives living in America. Terry Carty's family lives just a short distance from the branch camp located in Stuttgart, Arkansas. By chance, Carty's cousin, a German POW, was interred in the Stuttgart camp.
They had free on Sunday. My grandmother, my great uncle, and her and my grandmother's sister all went to the branch camp, and they asked the guard at the camp if they could see this German soldier, Rudolf Hahn, and they summoned him to the gate, and surprisingly they allowed him to step out of the compound, and they allowed him to sit in the car with them and talk about catching up on family history and people. They allowed him to sit out there for almost 3 hours. Finally, he went back inside, but as it turns out, when the Army Command found out they had a German POW who had relatives just a mile or so away, they packed him up and sent him off first to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then finally, ultimately, to Florence, Arizona, where he stayed until he was repatriated in 1946.
As the war progressed overseas, the POWs provided a valuable boost to Arkansas's agricultural economy with hard work. As the people of Arkansas worked side by side with German and Italian prisoners of war, the mistrust between POWs and their American captors began to fade.
I know one time we had a 10-man detail out, 10 German prisoners, and we had a guard with them, and this guard became real ill while they were out, and they were only a couple of miles from camp, and the guard actually passed out on him, so the prisoners picked the guard up and brought his loaded gun right on back into camp, and didn't think anything about taking off or doing anything other than returning him to camp and getting him some medical attention.
Like I said in the beginning, I hated them, and most everybody around here did. And but as a forgiving man, a Christian as I am, that I began to know them a little better, being around them. And they're just like you and I. They're good people, and I felt like I got to thinking about it one day. I said, they can't help. They're leaders. Old Hitler's doing what that's the reason why they over here, and that's why our boys are over there. And everybody seemed to kindly accept them and feel a little different about them. I know that our family did.
In May of 1945, the news came that everyone had been waiting for. The war in Europe was over, Hitler was dead, and Germany had surrendered unconditionally. For the Allies, this was great news. But the German prisoners of war, captive in the United States, were left in disbelief and fear of what lay ahead back home in Europe.
When they realized they were going to be repatriated, they began to of their own free will, they began to cut back on their rations because many of them had gained weight, and they didn't want to go home looking too prosperous, particularly when they knew that everybody in many people in Germany were on starvation rations.
May 17th, 1945. I see you all are still well, and I can say the same. I'm still doing my job here in the hospital. My father and mother have been well up to February 27th, the date of the last letter. Since that time, a lot of events have happened, but I hope they are still alive and well. When we heard the news from Europe, we first could not believe it, but then we had to. Your affectionate nephew, Hans.
Despite the fact fighting ceased in Europe, prisoner of war camps remained operational in Arkansas for another year due to the fact that labor in the state was still scarce. Arkansas Senator John McClellan lobbied Washington officials to keep the POW camps active and running until American GIs came back home to work. For the next year, the POWs continued to provide valuable services to Arkansas, including building hospitals, protecting communities from spring flooding, and saving the agricultural economy. While Arkansas was in the process of returning to normal after the war, prisoners of war could only count the days until they could return home.
September 25th, 1945. I'm still doing my job here at the regional hospital, and I'm feeling well. The other day I lost a good friend of mine. Because of a bad eye, he's going to be repatriated in the next weeks. According to the latest news, all POWs will be sent home in the early spring of 1946. Until that time comes, I will be patient. Your affectionate nephew, Hans.
Finally, in 1946, the camps began to close, and the prisoners of war who had known Arkansas as their home for nearly 3 years were about to return back to Germany. In May 1946, Corporal Heinz Bartel and the remaining POWs left Arkansas for the long trip back home.
May 3rd, 1946. The other day, I received a letter from home, dated April 4th, 1946. Father and mother are still well and fine. Our house has not been damaged. Finally, our day of departure has come. Saturday, May 4th, we are leaving from here and are going to Camp Shanks for embarkation. Once more, I would like to thank you all for everything you sent to me. I shall never forget it. Many greetings and good luck to you from your nephew, Hans.
It was a bittersweet moment for those former Africa Corps soldiers. They were no longer prisoners in a foreign land, but men returning home to a Europe devastated by war and soon to be divided by East-West confrontations. Meanwhile, American GIs came back to a prosperous United States, barely touched by World War. The economy in the United States and Arkansas was stable, due in part to labor provided by the prisoners of war. Most POWs remained in Germany to rebuild their country after the war. However, for some prisoners, the images of the United States, plus the kind and generous treatment they received as prisoners of war, compelled former POWs to leave Europe and come back to America to visit and even build successful lives as teachers, doctors, and engineers in this country. Today, little physical evidence remains of the prisoner of war camps that were scattered throughout Arkansas. Most of the facilities, materials, and equipment in the branch camps were dismantled and auctioned off. It is possible to find gravesite markers of German prisoners of war around the countryside. This part of Arkansas history is barely a footnote in textbooks. But for the men and women who were eyewitnesses to the prisoner of war camps, this period provides them with not only a unique perspective of Arkansas history, but also a greater insight into the human condition.
it was a real experience, and I wouldn't take anything for it. I wouldn't want to go through it again, because I'd hate to be in prison somewhere, and I know that those people really didn't care for it. But I would say that the prisoners of war that we had here, that they were well treated. I don't think any of them could ever say that they were mistreated in any way. And I don't know of any of our personnel that mistreated any.
Those guys went back to Germany as the leaders of the country because they had received good treatment at the hands of the Americans. They went back to Germany, taking up positions of leadership in the country. My relative Rudolf Hahn, he came away from here and with nothing but good feelings about the United States and about America. The long-term legacy is the fact that those people who are now in positions of leadership in Germany were German prisoners of war. They received good treatment, and consequently they have been a strong ally of the United States.
I guess, to sum it up in 2 words, just amazement. You know, of having prisoners of war here and working on the land here. But it's just amazing to think that it can happen in Arkansas.